The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of County Courthouse in Alabama, but 3-year-old Emma didn't notice. She didn't notice much of anything anymore. Not since that night 3 weeks ago when her world had shattered into a million pieces, each one too sharp and jagged for a child her age to understand. "Come on, sweetheart, just a few more steps." Sarah Mitchell, a veteran child services worker with 15 years of experience, knelt beside the small girl whose tiny hand had gone cold despite the warm October morning. Sarah had worked with hundreds of traumatized children, but something about Emma's case had burrowed deep into her heart and refused to let go. The child's enormous brown eyes, once bright and full of the innocent wonder that 3-year-olds possessed, now stared at nothing and everything all at once, as if she were looking through the world rather than at it. Emma's grandmother stood behind them, her weathered hands clutching a worn leather purse. At 68 years old, had never imagined she'd be raising her granddaughter under such horrific circumstances. The past 3 weeks had aged her a decade. Dark circles shadowed her eyes from sleepless nights spent listening to Emma's whimpering nightmares, holding the child when she woke up screaming, trying desperately to reach the little girl who had retreated somewhere deep inside herself where the monsters couldn't follow. "Emma, me," whispered in Spanish, her voice cracking. "We need to go inside now. The judge, she needs to hear what you saw. Then we can go home and I'll make you those special cookies you love." But Emma didn't respond. She hadn't spoken in 21 days. Not since Officer Martinez had found her huddled in the front yard at 2:47 a.m., her Princess Sophia pajamas grass-stained, her feet bare and cut from running across broken glass. Not since the ambulance lights had painted her pale face red and blue. Not since her world had changed forever. The courthouse loomed above them like a fortress, all imposing columns and stern stone faces carved into the architecture. To adults, it represented justice and order. To a traumatized toddler, it was just another scary place full of scary people who kept asking scary questions she didn't know how to answer. Sarah gently squeezed Emma's hand. "I know you're frightened, sweet girl, but I promise you, Judge is very kind. She is too. She just wants to make sure you're safe." Sarah's voice remained steady and warm, even as her heart broke for the 100th time that morning. In all her years of social work, she'd never seen a child shut down so completely. They climbed the courthouse steps slowly, Emma's small legs struggling with each rise. Her unicorn backpack, packed by with crayons, a coloring book, and Mr. Whiskers, her beloved stuffed rabbit, bounced against her back with each step. Had hoped familiar things might comfort her, but Emma hadn't touched any of them. She barely ate, barely slept, barely existed. Inside the courthouse, the air conditioning hit them like a wave. The massive lobby bustled with activity, attorneys in sharp suits hurrying past with leather briefcases, police officers comparing notes, families huddled on benches waiting for their cases to be called. The sounds echoed off the marble floors and high ceilings. Clicking heels, murmured conversations, the beep of metal detectors, a baby crying somewhere in the distance. Emma flinched at every sound. "We're going to courtroom 4, Sarah explained softly, leading them toward a hallway on the left. "Remember what we practiced. You'll sit in a special chair and Mr. the nice man we met yesterday will ask you some questions. You just tell him what you remember about that night, okay? And if you need a break, you just tell Judge. She's in charge and she'll make everyone stop and give you time." They'd rehearsed this a dozen times. Child psychologist Dr. Foster had worked with Emma for hours, using dolls and gentle play therapy to try to unlock whatever the child had witnessed. But Emma remained locked inside herself, protected by walls of silence that nobody could breach. Dr. Foster had warned them that forcing Emma to testify might cause more trauma, but legally, without her testimony, the custody hearing couldn't proceed properly. The system needed her voice, even if she'd lost it. As they walked down the long corridor, Emma's grip on Sarah's hand suddenly tightened. Her steps slowed. Noticed her granddaughter's breathing quicken, small, rapid breaths that signaled an oncoming panic attack. They'd happened 6 times already this week. "Emma, look at me," Sarah said, stopping and kneeling down to the child's eye level. "Breathe with me, sweetheart. In through your nose," she demonstrated, making it theatrical, trying to engage the child. "And out through your mouth, that's it. You're doing so well." A lawyer rushed past them, nearly bumping into, his phone pressed to his ear as he argued about case precedents and filing deadlines. He didn't even notice the small girl having a breakdown against the wall. "Maybe this is too much," whispered desperately to Sarah. "Look at her, she's terrified. Can't we postpone? Can't someone else?" "I wish we could," Sarah replied quietly, her own eyes glistening. "But the judge has already delayed once. Emma's testimony is crucial for determining her placement. I know it's horrible, but we have to try." Emma's breathing gradually slowed. She stared down at her light-up sneakers, pink and purple with cartoon characters on the sides. Had bought them last week, hoping they might spark some joy. Emma had barely reacted when she put them on. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Courtroom 4 waited at the end, its massive wooden doors closed like the gates to some daunting castle. Behind those doors, a judge would decide Emma's future. Behind those doors, adults would dissect the worst night of her life and ask her to relive it in excruciating detail. Behind those doors, though nobody knew it yet, an unexpected guardian waited, one who had already saved this little girl once before. "Ready?" Sarah asked gently, though she knew Emma wasn't. Nobody could ever truly be ready for this. Emma didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. She simply stared at those courthouse doors with the resigned expression of someone far too young to look so hopeless. Together, they walked toward courtroom 4, 3 people bound together by tragedy and the desperate hope that somehow, someway, Emma might find her voice again before it was too late. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4 swung open with a low creak that seemed to echo through Emma's entire body. Sarah felt the child's hand go rigid in hers, every tiny muscle tensing like a frightened animal preparing to bolt. The courtroom stretched before them, a cavernous space with dark wood paneling, rows of benches like church pews, and an elevated judge's bench that towered over everything like a throne. But Emma saw none of that. Her eyes locked immediately onto the magnificent German shepherd sitting with perfect posture near the judge's bench, and for the first time in 3 weeks, something flickered across her vacant expression. Recognition. Hope. Sarah couldn't quite identify it, but it was something. The first genuine emotion she'd seen from the child since that terrible night. The dog was beautiful in the way that working animals often are, not pampered or decorative, but powerful and purposeful. His coat was a rich mixture of black and tan, perfectly groomed and gleaming under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. He sat absolutely still, his dark, intelligent eyes surveying the room with an alertness that somehow managed to be both vigilant and calm. A navy blue vest wrapped around his muscular frame, emblazoned with yellow letters that read Courthouse K9 Do Not Pet, and beneath it, in smaller text, Certified Therapy Dog. Beside the dog stood Officer, a 12-year veteran of the police department's K9 unit. At 41 years old, had the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much of humanity's dark side but somehow maintained faith in its potential for good. His uniform was crisp and professional, his posture military straight, but his eyes, hazel and deeply kind, told a different story than his imposing 6'2" frame suggested. Noticed the little girl staring at Max the moment she entered. Something about her wide brown eyes tugged at his memory, like a song he'd heard before but couldn't quite place. He'd been working with Max for 6 years now, and they'd been called to hundreds of scenes together. Faces blurred together after a while, especially the victims', especially the children's. It was a defense mechanism, his therapist had told him. You couldn't save everyone, and you'd go crazy trying to remember them all. But something about this child felt important. Judge, a stern-looking woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in an impeccable bun, and reading glasses perched on her nose, looked up from the case file spread before her. She'd been a family court judge for 18 years, presiding over countless custody battles, abuse cases, and child welfare hearings. She'd learned long ago that the presence of a therapy dog could make all the difference when traumatized children had to testify. That's why she'd specifically requested Officer and Max for today's proceeding. "Ms. Mitchell, please bring the child forward," Judge said, her voice firm but not unkind. She'd read Dr. Foster's psychological evaluation. She knew what she was asking of this little girl. Sarah guided Emma down the center aisle, their footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. Followed close behind, her rosary beads clicking softly in her trembling hands as she whispered prayers in Spanish. The courtroom wasn't crowded, just the essential parties. The prosecutor, James, a 40-something man with kind eyes and a reputation for being gentle with child witnesses. The defense attorney, Robert, who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation despite his legal obligation to be there. A court reporter, an older woman named who'd been recording testimonies for 30 years and thought she'd seen everything. A bailiff standing by the door, looking bored. And now, 3 more people who would forever change the trajectory of this case. Emma's eyes never left the German Shepherd. She didn't look at the judge, didn't acknowledge the attorneys, didn't seem to hear Sarah's gentle words of encouragement. She was fixated entirely on Max, and Max, with the uncanny intuition that made him exceptional at his job, was watching her too. Notice the dog's ears perk forward slightly, a subtle shift in his attention that most people wouldn't catch. Max had gone from general alertness to focused interest. His tail, which had been still, gave one small thump against the floor. His hand instinctively moved to rest on Max's head, a gesture of connection and control that they'd practiced thousands of times. "Easy boy," whispered so quietly that only Max could hear. "We're working." But Max's attention remained fixed on the small girl being led to the front of the courtroom. And then something extraordinary happened, something that, in all his years of K-9 work, had rarely witnessed. Max whined. It was soft, almost inaudible, but felt it vibrate through the dog's body beneath his hand. It was the sound Max made when he was trying to communicate something important, when his training conflicted with his instincts. What was it about this child? Emma had stopped walking. Sarah was trying to coax her forward, but the little girl had planted her feet, still staring at Max. Her grandmother knelt beside her, whispering encouragement, but Emma seemed to exist in a bubble where only she and the dog mattered. Judge observed this interaction with growing interest. She'd seen children react to Max before. Some were afraid, some were curious, most were eventually comforted by his presence. But this was different. This child wasn't just seeing a dog. She was seeing this specific dog, and it clearly meant something to her. "Officer," the judge said, her voice cutting through the tense silence, "has your K-9 had any previous contact with this witness?" His brow furrowed as he scanned his memory. Emma. The name had been in the briefing he'd received that morning, but he hadn't paid much attention to it. He'd been focused on Max's preparation, ensuring the dog was calm and ready for what could be an emotionally charged day. Now he studied the child's face more carefully, the dark curls, the brown eyes, the small frame. And then it hit him like a physical blow. The front yard, the broken glass, the sobbing child in Princess Sophia pajamas. 3 weeks ago, the domestic disturbance call on Oak Street. He and Max had been first to respond when the call came through at 2:43 a.m. Domestic violence in progress, child on scene. Had arrived to chaos. His partner restraining an intoxicated father, a mother being treated by paramedics for a head wound, and this little girl, this exact little girl, sitting alone in the dark front yard, surrounded by broken glass and broken dreams, crying so hard she was hyperventilating. Had brought Max over without thinking twice. The dog had always had a gift with traumatized children. Max had approached slowly, gently, and when Emma had reached out with shaking hands, he'd settled beside her, letting her bury her face in his fur. They'd stayed like that for nearly half an hour while the scene was processed, while statements were taken, while Emma's world fell apart around her. And then Child Services had arrived, and had watched them take Emma away, and he'd filed his report, and he'd moved on to the next call, the next crisis, the next person who needed help. He'd forgotten her. But she hadn't forgotten Max. "Your Honor," said, his voice rough with sudden emotion, "yes, we've met before." Revelation hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Judge leaned forward, her reading glasses slipping down her nose as she studied Officer's face. The courtroom, which had been filled with the usual rustling of papers and shifting bodies, fell into an attentive silence. "Explain, officer," the judge commanded, her tone sharp with interest. Cleared his throat, his hand still resting protectively on Max's head. "3 weeks ago, Your Honor, Max and I responded to a domestic disturbance call at 2847 Oak Street. When we arrived, the situation was volatile. My partner secured the adults involved while I found the child," he gestured toward Emma, "in the front yard. She was severely traumatized, hyperventilating. Max calmed her down. We stayed with her until Child Services arrived." Sarah's eyes widened. She'd read the police report dozens of times, but it had been clinical, sterile, officers responded, scene secured, child removed to protective custody. Nobody had mentioned that this specific officer, this specific dog, had comforted Emma during the worst night of her life. Gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. She remembered that night in fragments, being called at 3 a.m., rushing to the hospital, finding her daughter with a concussion and her son-in-law in handcuffs, being told Emma was with Child Services. But she'd never known about the police dog, about those precious minutes when a gentle animal had given her granddaughter something to hold onto in the darkness. Judge made a note on her legal pad, her expression unreadable. "Interesting. Please continue with the proceedings." She looked at Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, bring the witness to the stand." Sarah gently tugged Emma's hand, and this time the little girl moved. But her eyes remained locked on Max, tracking him like a compass needle finding north. They approached the witness stand, an imposing wooden structure that seemed designed to make adults feel small, let alone a 3-year-old child. A pink booster seat had been placed on the chair, a small concession to Emma's size that somehow made the whole situation feel even more heartbreaking. Sarah lifted Emma onto the seat, adjusting it so the child could see over the edge of the witness box. Emma's legs dangled several inches off the ground, her light-up sneakers kicking slightly in the air. Her small hands gripped the wooden railing in front of her, knuckles white with tension. "You're doing so well, Emma," Sarah whispered, brushing a curl away from the child's face. "So brave. Just answer the questions as best you can, okay?" But Emma wasn't listening. She was still staring at Max, who sat perfectly still across the courtroom, a living statue of black and tan fur. Prosecutor James approached the witness stand with careful, measured steps. He'd been briefed extensively on Emma's condition, the selective mutism, the trauma, the psychological fragility. He carried no briefcase, no notes, nothing that might seem threatening. Just himself, in a deliberately casual navy suit instead of his usual formal black, trying to be as non-intimidating as possible. "Hi, Emma," he said softly, stopping several feet away to give her space. "My name is James. We met yesterday, remember, at Ms. Sarah's office." Silence. Emma's eyes flickered to him for just a second before returning to Max. Her breathing had quickened, small shallow breaths that made Sarah's heart clench with worry. "Emma, can you tell us your name?" James asked, his voice gentle and patient. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenography machine, waiting. Silence. Judge watched intently, her expression growing increasingly concerned. She'd seen reluctant witnesses before, but something about this child's frozen terror was particularly unsettling. "That's okay," James continued, maintaining his calm demeanor even as he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Can you tell us how old you are? Can you hold up your fingers to show me?" Emma's hands remained clenched on the railing. She didn't move, didn't speak, barely seemed to breathe. Sitting in the front row, pressed her rosary beads so hard into her palm that they left imprints. She wanted to rush forward, to scoop her granddaughter into her arms and take her away from this horrible place, these horrible questions, this horrible reliving of horrible memories. James tried a different approach. "Emma, do you know why you're here today?" "Nothing." "Can you tell us where you live?" "Silence." "Who takes care of you?" The ticking of the courtroom clock suddenly seemed deafening. The court reporter shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The bailiff by the door watched with visible sympathy. Even defense attorney Robert, who had every professional reason to hope this testimony wouldn't happen, looked pained by the child's obvious distress. James glanced at Judge, uncertainty flickering across his face. How many questions should he ask? When did persistence become cruelty? Judge gave him a small nod. "Continue." "Emma," James said, his voice dropping even softer, "I know this is scary, but we need to understand what happened on the night when the police came to your house. Can you tell us about that night?" Emma's bottom lip began to quiver. It was the first real emotion she'd shown since taking the stand, and somehow that made it worse. Sarah, standing nearby, took an instinctive step forward, ready to intervene if the child completely broke down. "Do you remember that night, Emma?" James pressed gently. "The night when it was very late and there was yelling and the police officers came." A single tear rolled down Emma's cheek. Let out a soft sob from the gallery, quickly muffling it with her hand. "Can you tell us what you saw that night, what you heard?" Another tear, then another, but still no words. Emma's whole body had begun to tremble, her small frame shaking like a leaf in a storm. Watch from his position near the judge's bench, his jaw clenched tight. He'd seen this before, children so traumatized that speaking became physically impossible, as if their voices had been stolen along with their sense of safety. Max sensed his handler's tension and whined softly, his tail giving a concerned thump against the floor. James asked 3 more questions. Each one was met with silence. The courtroom felt like it was suffocating under the weight of that silence, a silence that screamed louder than any testimony could. Judge removed her reading glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose. This wasn't working. The child was shutting down completely, retreating further into herself with each question. They were losing her. "Mister," the judge began, clearly about to call a recess, to stop this painful exercise in futility. But then it happened. Without warning, without any indication that she was about to move, Emma's small arm shot up into the air. Her finger extended, pointing across the courtroom with startling precision and intensity. The courtroom became a photograph. James froze mid-step, his mouth half open with his next question unspoken. Judge's hand stopped halfway to her gavel. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Stood up without realizing it, her rosary beads slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor with a sound like rainfall. Fingers froze over her stenography machine. The bailiff straightened from his casual lean against the wall. Even Robert, the defense attorney who'd been checking his phone, looked up sharply. Emma's finger remained extended, unwavering, pointing directly at Officer and his K-9 partner Max. The silence stretched, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The moment felt suspended in amber, preserved and eternal. What was the child trying to say? Was she afraid? Was she identifying someone? Was this a breakthrough or a breakdown? Felt his heart hammering in his chest. Max's ears perked forward, fully alert now, sensing that something monumental was happening but not understanding what. And then, after what felt like an eternity but was really only 20 seconds of absolute, suffocating silence, Emma's small voice, barely more than a whisper, but clear enough to reach every corner of that courtroom, finally broke free. "That's the nice from the scary night. The words hung in the air like a bell that had been struck, reverberating through every soul in that courtroom. For a moment, one eternal, crystallized moment, the world stopped spinning on its axis. That's the nice from the scary night. Emma's voice, though small and trembling, carried the weight of 3 weeks of silence. It was the first complete sentence anyone had heard her speak since that terrible night on Oak Street. The first words, the first breakthrough, the first fragile step back toward the living world. Judge felt her throat constrict with unexpected emotion. In 18 years on the bench, she'd maintained professional distance from thousands of cases, but something about this tiny voice cracked through her carefully constructed walls. Her hand, which had been reaching for the gavel to call a recess, remained suspended in midair, trembling slightly. Sarah Mitchell's eyes flooded with tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of trying everything: play therapy, art therapy, music therapy, gentle coaxing, patient silence. 3 weeks of watching this beautiful child exist in a prison of her own trauma. And now, because of a dog, the prison door had finally cracked open. Collapsed back onto the bench, her hands clutching her chest as sobs racked her body. "Gracias, she whispered over and over, rocking back and forth. "Gracias, thank God, thank God." Her granddaughter had spoken. Her Emma had come back. Prosecutor James stood frozen, his careful questions forgotten. He'd been prepared for continued silence, for an eventual recess, for the possibility that they'd have to proceed without Emma's testimony. He had not been prepared for this, for the raw, unfiltered moment of a traumatized child recognizing her savior. Defense attorney Robert, a 30-year veteran who'd convinced himself he was beyond being moved by courtroom drama, found his eyes stinging. He'd been planning to object, to argue that the child was too traumatized to testify reliably. Now those legal strategies felt hollow and cruel in the face of such profound vulnerability. The court reporter stopped typing entirely. Her professional obligation was to record everything, but her hands wouldn't cooperate. They shook too badly. She transcribed murder confessions, custody battles that tore families apart, testimonies from abuse victims that haunted her dreams. But she'd never seen anything quite like this. This moment of pure recognition between a broken child and the animal who'd held her together when everything else was falling apart. But the most profound reaction came from Officer. The color drained from his face as memory crashed over him like a tidal wave. Suddenly, he wasn't standing in a courtroom anymore. He was kneeling in wet grass at 2:47 a.m., his flashlight cutting through the darkness, finding a small figure in pink pajamas sitting among shards of broken glass. He remembered the sounds: a woman screaming inside the house, his partner shouting commands, a man slurred cursing, sirens wailing in the distance. And underneath it all, a child's sobs, deep, wrenching sounds that no 3-year-old should ever have to make. He remembered bringing Max over, the dog's training taking over, the gentle approach. He remembered this exact little girl, though he hadn't known her name then, hadn't known anything except that she needed help and he had a dog who could provide it. He remembered how she'd reached for Max with desperate hands, how she'd buried her face in his fur, and held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to quicksand. He remembered sitting beside her in the grass for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, not speaking, just being there while Max did what Max did best, offering silent, unconditional comfort to someone whose world was ending. He remembered child services arriving, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes gently prying Emma's fingers from Max's fur, promising her everything would be okay. He remembered Emma screaming as they carried her away, reaching back toward Max, her small voice crying, until she disappeared into a white van with official county seals on the doors. And then he'd gone to his next call, and then he'd gone home, and then he'd filed his report, and then he'd moved on. Because that's what you did in this job. You couldn't carry every victim with you. You couldn't remember every face. You couldn't let every tragedy break you, or you'd be no use to anyone. But standing here now, looking at this tiny girl pointing at Max with such desperate recognition, realized he'd been wrong. He should have remembered. He should have followed up. He should have known that 30 minutes of comfort from a therapy dog wouldn't erase the trauma. It would only create a lifeline, a connection, something for this child to hold onto in the darkness. "Max," whispered, his voice cracking. The dog's ears swiveled toward him, alert to the emotion in his handler's voice. Max's tail began to wag, slowly at first, then faster. The dog stood up, his whole body vibrating with the barely contained desire to move, to go to the child he clearly remembered. His training held him in place, but every muscle in his body strained toward Emma. Emma's arm was still extended, still pointing, but now her whole face had transformed. The blank, traumatized expression was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. Her eyes, those enormous brown eyes that had been so vacant for so long, were suddenly, startlingly alive. "The nice," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "He let me hug him when everything was scary." Judge finally found her voice. "Officer." Her words came out rougher than intended, emotion making her sound almost harsh. "Officer, is what this child saying true?" Had to clear his throat twice before he could respond. "Yes, Your Honor. Max and I were first responders to the domestic disturbance at Emma's home 3 weeks ago. I didn't realize," his voice broke, "I didn't realize she was the witness for today's hearing." The judge's hand moved to her chest, pressing against her heart as if she could physically hold it together. 18 years. 18 years of custody battles and abuse cases and children crying on witness stands. 18 years of maintaining professional composure. And now, in this moment, she felt every one of those years bearing down on her. "Mister," she said, her voice barely steady, "do you have further questions for this witness at this time?" James looked at Emma, then at Max, then back at the judge. His legal mind was racing through possibilities, through the significance of what had just happened. But his human heart, the part of him that had 3 daughters at home and couldn't imagine what this little girl had endured, that part knew exactly what needed to happen next. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "I believe the witness might be more comfortable if—" But he never got to finish his sentence, because Emma was climbing down from the witness stand. Sarah reached out instinctively to help her, but Emma was moving with more purpose than she'd shown in weeks. Her light-up sneakers hit the floor with small thuds, the lights flashing pink and purple with each step. And then she was walking, not toward her grandmother, not toward the exit, not toward safety. She was walking directly toward Max. The courtroom held its collective breath. Every eye followed the tiny figure crossing the vast space between the witness stand and the judge's bench where Officer and Max stood. The distance couldn't have been more than 30 feet, but it felt like miles, an impossible journey across a canyon of trauma and fear and desperate, fragile hope. Max's tail wagged harder. His hand tightened on the dog's collar, uncertain whether to allow this, whether it was appropriate, whether it would help or harm. But Judge, in a moment of judicial wisdom that transcended law and procedure and protocol, said just one word. "Let her." The word "let her" from Judge echoed through the courtroom like a benediction, and suddenly the formal structure of legal proceedings dissolved. This was no longer just a custody hearing. This was a moment of raw human and canine connection that transcended courtroom protocol. Emma took another step forward, then another. Her small shoes made soft, squeaking sounds against the polished floor. Sarah moved to follow her, protective instincts kicking in, but Judge raised a hand, stopping her. Everyone needed to see this. Everyone needed to witness what happened when trauma met healing. His throat felt tight as he watched the little girl approach. His training told him to maintain control, to keep Max in position, to follow procedure. But his heart, his father's heart, his human heart, told him something entirely different. He loosened his grip on Max's collar incrementally, giving the dog permission without words. Max understood immediately. The German Shepherd had been trained for thousands of hours, had worked hundreds of scenes, had comforted countless victims. But dogs don't just follow training, they follow their hearts too. And Max's heart remembered this child. The dog's body language shifted from formal working posture to something gentler. His tail wagged in slow, sweeping arcs. His ears, which had been alert and forward, softened slightly. He took one careful step forward, then stopped, waiting to see if the child would accept his approach. Emma stopped 3 feet away from Max. She was so small, so fragile, standing there in her purple dress that had carefully ironed that morning, her hair pulled back with butterfly clips, her face streaked with tears. For a moment, she seemed uncertain, as if the courage that had carried her across the courtroom was suddenly depleted. "It's okay, sweetheart," said softly, kneeling down to the child's level. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the evidence of sleepless nights and nightmares. He could see the way her hands trembled, the rapid rise and fall of her small chest. "Max remembers you. He's been waiting to see you again." It was a liberty with the truth. Hadn't known they'd see this child again, hadn't thought about her in weeks if he was being honest. But somehow, looking at Max's behavior, at the way the dog's entire being focused on Emma with an intensity that went beyond training, believed his own words. Max had remembered. Animals remembered trauma victims in ways humans sometimes forgot to. The memory of that night crashed over with vivid, painful clarity. He'd been ending a double shift, exhausted and ready to go home to his quiet apartment and his own demons, when the call came through. "Domestic in progress, 2847 Oak Street. Child on scene. Respond code 3. He'd arrived to a nightmare. The front door hanging off its hinges. A woman's blood on the porch steps. His partner, Martinez, wrestling a drunk, violent man twice his size. Neighbors standing in their yards in bathrobes and curlers, watching the family implode in real time. And there, in the middle of the front yard, surrounded by broken glass from a thrown whiskey bottle, sat the smallest person had ever seen look so utterly destroyed. She'd been crying so hard she was choking on her own sobs, her whole body convulsing with the effort to breathe. He'd seen Max's reaction immediately. The dog had pulled toward the child before even gave a command. That's when he knew this was bad. Max had instincts that went beyond training, and those instincts were screaming that this child needed help. Had approached slowly that night, announcing himself. "Hey, sweetheart, I'm Officer, this is Max. We're here to help you. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." But Emma hadn't responded to his words. She'd been beyond words, beyond comfort, beyond anything except pure survival mode. So had done the only thing he could think of. He'd brought Max closer and let the dog work his magic. Max had approached with that same gentle care he was showing now, reading the child's body language, understanding her fear. And when Emma had reached out with shaking hands, Max had settled beside her as if he'd been born for that exact moment. Remembered how Emma had grabbed fistfuls of Max's fur and buried her face in his neck, sobbing words that didn't make sense. "Daddy hurt Mommy," and so loud, and the glass everywhere, and "Make it stop, make it stop." Max had remained perfectly still, absorbing her grief and terror, his presence a solid anchor in her capsizing world. They'd stayed like that for 27 minutes. Knew because he'd checked his watch, documenting the time for his report. 27 minutes while the scene was processed, while Emma's mother was loaded into an ambulance, while her father was arrested and read his rights, while neighbors gave statements about the screaming they'd heard, the crashes, the woman's pleas for help. 27 minutes of a little girl clinging to a dog, who represented the only kindness in the worst night of her life. And then Child Services had arrived. Sarah Mitchell, though hadn't registered her name at the time, and she gently, carefully Emma's fingers from Max's fur. Emma had screamed, reaching back for the dog, her small voice breaking as she cried, "No, want the." Had watched them drive away, Max whining beside him, both of them feeling the loss of a connection they didn't fully understand. Now standing in this courtroom 3 weeks later understood that 27 minutes had meant everything to this child. In a world that had suddenly become violent and unpredictable and terrifying, Max had been safe. Max had been kind. Max had been constant. Emma took the final step forward and dropped to her knees in front of Max. The dog moved slowly, carefully, closing the distance between them. And then, just like that night in the grass, Emma wrapped her small arms around Max's neck and held on. "The nice," she whispered into his fur. "You came back. I thought you were gone forever." Max's tail wagged harder, and he made a soft sound. Not quite a whine, not quite a whimper, but something tender and comforting. His large head curved around to nuzzle Emma's back, and could see the dog's training warring with his instincts to protect this child. The courtroom watched in absolute silence. Sobs were the only sound, punctuated by the soft scratch of the court reporter frantically wiping her eyes while trying to record this moment. Judge stood up behind her bench, a breach of protocol, but she didn't care. She needed to see this properly, needed to witness what was unfolding before her. Emma pulled back just enough to look into Max's dark eyes. "I was so scared," she told the dog, her 3-year-old vocabulary struggling to express trauma too big for words. "Everything was loud and scary, and Mommy was crying, and there was red stuff everywhere, and I ran outside, and the ground was sharp, and then you came." Her small hands cupped Max's face with surprising gentleness. "You made the scary smaller." Felt something break open in his chest. In all his years of police work, in all the scenes he'd responded to, in all the victims he'd helped, he'd never truly understood the impact of those moments until now. He'd thought he was just doing his job. He hadn't realized he was saving a life. "Max remembers you too," Emma said, his voice rough with emotion. "He's been thinking about you." It was anthropomorphizing perhaps, but watching Max's behavior, the gentle attention, the protective posture, the way he leaned into Emma's embrace, believed it was true. Emma looked up for the first time, really seeing him. "You were the policeman. You said I was brave." His memory stumbled. Had he said that? He must have, though he didn't specifically remember. "You are brave," he said now, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "The bravest person I've ever met." Judge had presided over family court for 18 years. She'd seen manipulation tactics disguised as parental love. She'd witnessed custody battles that used children as weapons. She'd made decisions that kept children safe and decisions that kept her awake at night wondering if she'd done the right thing. She'd followed the law, precedent, and procedure with unwavering dedication. But standing there, watching a traumatized 3-year-old find solace in the fur of a therapy dog, watching the first genuine signs of healing emerge from weeks of devastating silence, made a decision that had nothing to do with precedent and everything to do with justice. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority, "would Max be able to accompany this witness during her testimony?" The courtroom erupted with whispers. Sarah's head snapped toward the judge, hope blazing in her eyes, gasped, clutching her chest. Prosecutor James's eyebrows shot up, but a slow smile spread across his face. This could work. But defense attorney Robert was on his feet before the judge finished speaking. "Your Honor, I must object." His voice carried the sharp edge of legal training, though even he looked conflicted. "This is highly irregular. There's no precedent for having an animal." "Sit down, counselor." Judge's voice cracked like a whip and froze mid-sentence. "I am well aware of courtroom precedent. I'm also aware that we have a traumatized witness who hasn't spoken in 3 weeks and has just demonstrated clear psychological attachment to a certified therapy animal who was present during her initial trauma. Now sit down." Sat, though his jaw clenched with professional frustration. He knew when to push and when to yield, and something in Judge's tone told him this was not a battle he would win. The judge turned her attention back to who still knelt beside Emma and Max. "Officer, I asked you a question. Can Max perform his therapy duties while accompanying a witness on the stand?" His mind raced. Max had been trained extensively as a therapy dog. He'd worked with domestic violence victims, child witnesses, sexual assault survivors, but always from a distance, always as a calming presence in the courtroom, never directly beside a witness during testimony. The protocols were unclear. The insurance implications were uncertain. The legal ramifications could be complicated. But looking down at Emma, who had finally stopped crying and was resting her head against Max's shoulder, her small fingers twisted gently in his fur, knew there was only one answer. "Yes, Your Honor," he said firmly. "Max is trained for exactly this type of situation. He's worked with trauma victims for 6 years. He knows how to remain calm and still. He won't interfere with the proceedings." Judge nodded, her decision crystallizing. "Mister, do you have any objections to this accommodation for your witness?" James stepped forward, choosing his words carefully. "No objection, Your Honor. In fact, the prosecution believes this accommodation serves the interests of justice. We need this child's testimony, but not at the cost of re-traumatizing her. If the presence of Officers K-9 allows Emma to communicate what she witnessed, then we support this measure wholeheartedly." Mr. Judge turned to the defense attorney, her expression making it clear that his objection had better be substantial. Stood again, and for a moment, everyone in the courtroom held their breath. His job was to defend his client's interests, to challenge anything that might prejudice the case against his client. A cute dog comforting a child witness could absolutely influence the emotional temperature of a courtroom. But Robert had 3 of them. The youngest was 4 years old, just a year older than Emma, and he couldn't stop thinking about how he'd feel if one of his had been through what this little girl had endured. "No objection, Your Honor," he said quietly and sat down. Judge nodded, satisfied. "Very well. For the record, I am making an accommodation for this witness based on her age, her psychological state, and her demonstrated connection to this certified therapy animal. This is not precedent for future cases. Each case must be evaluated on its individual merits." She looked directly at Emma. "This child has a right to feel safe while providing testimony. If the presence of this trained therapy dog helps her communicate, I'm not only allowing it, I'm ordering it." She turned back to, "Officer, bring Max to the witness stand. The dog will remain with the witness for the duration of her testimony." His throat tightened with emotion. "Yes, Your Honor, thank you, Your Honor." He looked down at Emma, who was watching the exchange with wide, hopeful eyes. "Emma, would you like Max to sit with you while you answer Mister's questions?" Emma nodded vigorously, the first truly animated response anyone had seen from her in weeks. "Yes, please. I want the nice to stay with me." Sarah approached carefully, not wanting to break the spell. "Emma, sweetie, we're going to go back to the special chair now, okay? But this time Max is coming with you." "An officer?" Emma asked, looking up with sudden concern, as if afraid he might disappear like he had that night. His heart clenched. "I'll be right there too, Emma. I'm not going anywhere. Max and we're a team. Where he goes, I go." Together, they made their way back to the witness stand, an unlikely procession that would be remembered by everyone in that courtroom for the rest of their lives. Carried Max's lead loosely in one hand. Emma walked between them, one small hand resting on Max's back as if drawing strength directly from his presence. When they reached the witness stand, Sarah helped Emma down from the booster seat. The little girl immediately dropped to the floor, her purple dress spreading around her like flower petals. Max settled beside her without needing a command, his training and his instincts perfectly aligned. He lay down, positioning his body so Emma could lean against him, and she immediately curled into his side. Stood nearby, close enough to maintain control but far enough to give Emma space. He met Judge's eyes and saw approval there, along with something that looked like gratitude. The judge addressed the courtroom, We will proceed with testimony. I want absolute silence. No interruptions unless I call for them. This child has been through enough without adding more stress." Her gaze swept across every face. "Mister, you may continue your examination." Gently. James approached the witness stand for the second time, but the energy was completely different now. Emma wasn't frozen in terror. She wasn't shutting down. She was sitting on the courtroom floor with her arms around a German shepherd, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she looked like she might actually be ready to speak. "Hi again, Emma," James said softly, crouching down to her level rather than towering over her. "I'm so glad Max is here with you now. He seems like a very good friend." "He's the best friend," Emma said, her voice muffled against Max's fur but clear enough to be heard. "He saved me when everything was scary." James glanced at the judge, who nodded for him to proceed. This was it, the moment they'd been working toward for 3 weeks. "Emma," James said gently, "can you tell us about the scary night, the night when you met Max?" For a moment, silence hung in the air again, but this time it was different. This time, Emma wasn't frozen with trauma. She was gathering her thoughts, her small hand stroking Max's fur in steady, calming motions. Then she began to speak. Emma's small hand continued its rhythmic motion through Max's fur, stroke, pause, as if each touch gave her the courage to release one more word, one more memory, one more piece of the nightmare she'd been carrying alone. "It was nighttime," she began, her 3-year-old vocabulary struggling to contain experiences no child should have to describe. "I was sleeping in my big girl bed. Mr. Whiskers was with me." She glanced around, suddenly concerned. "Mr. Whiskers is my bunny. Grandma brought him today." "That's wonderful, Emma," James said softly, maintaining his crouched position to stay at her eye level. "So you were sleeping with Mr. Whiskers. What happened next?" Emma's fingers tightened slightly in Max's fur, and the dog shifted almost imperceptibly closer to her, sensing her rising anxiety. Watched his partner work, marveling at Max's intuitive understanding of exactly what this child needed. "There was yelling," Emma said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Daddy was using his really loud voice, the one that makes my tummy hurt." In the gallery, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, fresh tears streaming down her face. Sarah stood nearby, her professional composure cracking as she listened to this tiny child describe domestic violence with the limited language of a toddler. "What was Daddy saying?" James asked gently. "Do you remember?" Emma shook her head. "Bad words. Words that Mommy says I'm not allowed to say. He was saying them really, really loud." She paused, burying her face in Max's neck for a moment before continuing. "And Mommy was crying. She was saying, 'Please stop,' and not in front of Emma, and you're scaring her." Judge's pen moved across her notepad, documenting every word, her judicial mask firmly in place even as her heart shattered for this child. "Were you scared, Emma?" James asked. So scared," Emma confirmed, her eyes wide with the memory. "My tummy hurt and my heart was going really fast like when I run too much. I put my pillow over my head but I could still hear everything." "What did you hear?" Emma's breathing quickened. Max's ears swiveled toward her, and he lifted his head slightly, pressing his nose against her cheek in a gesture of comfort. Emma responded by wrapping both arms around his neck, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I heard the big crash," she said, her voice shaking. "Like when I dropped Grandma's plate that time, but way, way louder. And then Mommy screamed really loud. Not like when she's happy or playing, like she was hurt." James exchanged a glance with Judge. This aligned perfectly with the police report and the mother's medical records. A whiskey bottle thrown at close range, resulting in a concussion and 7 stitches. "What did you do when you heard the crash and Mommy's scream?" James continued, his voice infinitely gentle. "I got out of bed," Emma said. "I was going to check on Mommy because she teaches me that when someone is hurt, we help them. But when I opened my door, I saw," her voice broke, and she stopped speaking entirely. The courtroom held its breath. This was the critical moment, the testimony they needed, but also the most traumatic memory for Emma to access. Took a small step closer, ready to intervene if needed, but Max was already working his magic. The dog shifted his position so Emma could lean more fully against him, providing a furry barrier between her and the memory. "Take your time, Emma," James said. "You're doing so well, so brave. What did you see when you opened your door?" Emma's next words came out in a rush, as if she needed to expel them quickly before they poisoned her from the inside. "I saw Daddy holding Mommy's arms really tight, and she was crying, and there was red stuff on her face, and Daddy saw me and he yelled, 'Get back in your room.' But he looked scary and Mommy looked hurt, and I got more scared and I ran." "Where did you run to, Emma?" "Outside. I ran to the front door and I opened it. I'm big enough to reach the handle now. And I ran into the yard, but then there was glass everywhere and it was sharp and it hurt my feet, and I sat down and I couldn't stop crying because everything was scary and wrong, and I wanted Mommy, but Daddy was hurting her and I didn't know what to do." The words tumbled out like water breaking through a dam, 3 weeks of silence exploding into a torrent of 3-year-old trauma. The court reporter typed frantically, tears blurring her vision as she captured every heartbreaking word. "And that's when you met Max," James prompted gently, trying to guide Emma toward a less traumatic memory. Emma's expression transformed immediately, fear melting into something softer. "Yes. I was crying so much and my feet hurt and I was cold because I only had my Princess Sophia pajamas, and then I heard a voice saying, 'Hey, sweetheart, I'm Officer.' And I looked up and there was this big." She smiled for the first time, an actual genuine smile that lit up her tear-stained face. "I was scared he might bite because he was so big, but Officer said, 'This is Max. He's here to help you.' And Max came over really, really slow, and he was so soft and warm, and he let me hug him." Felt his eyes burning. Hearing Emma describe that moment from her perspective, the fear, the relief, the desperate need for comfort that Max had fulfilled, made it real in a way his own memories hadn't. "Max sat with me for a long, long time," Emma continued, her voice steadier now, stronger. "I told him about the scary night and he listened, and he didn't go away even though there were lots of loud noises and lights and people. He stayed right with me the whole time." "Did Max make you feel safer?" James asked. "So much safer," Emma said emphatically. "He made the scary smaller, like the scary was still there, but Max was bigger than the scary, so I knew I would be okay." James glanced at his notes, then at Judge, silently communicating that he had the testimony he needed. The judge gave a small nod of understanding. "Emma, just a few more questions," James said. "Before that night, had Daddy ever been really loud and scary before?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Lots of times. Mommy would send me to my room and close the door, but I could still hear." "And did you ever see Daddy hurt Mommy before that night?" A pause. Emma's hand stilled in Max's fur. "One time I saw him push her really hard and she fell down. Mommy said she tripped, but I saw him push her." The courtroom was silent except for muffled sobs. Even defense attorney sat still, no longer making notes, no longer preparing objections. He was simply bearing witness to a child's truth. "Thank you, Emma," James said softly. "You've been incredibly brave today. I know that was hard to talk about." Emma looked up at him with those enormous brown eyes that had seen too much. "It was hard," she agreed. "But Max helped me be brave. He's good at that." James straightened up, his knees protesting from the prolonged crouch. "Your Honor, the prosecution has no further questions for this witness." Judge looked at, "Counselor, do you wish to cross-examine?" Stood slowly and everyone in the courtroom tensed, but when he spoke, his voice was gentle, almost grandfatherly. "No, Your Honor, no questions for this witness." It was the right decision, the humane decision, and everyone in the courtroom, including his client, knew it. Judge nodded. Emma, thank you for being so brave today. You did a wonderful job. You can go sit with your grandma now. But Emma didn't move immediately. Instead, she pressed her face into Max's fur one more time and whispered something that only the dog could hear. Max's tail thumped twice against the floor in response. Then Emma stood up, smoothed down her purple dress, and walked over to her grandmother with her head held high. No longer a silent victim, but a child who had found her voice. And she had found it because a German shepherd named Max had shown her that even in the darkest moments, even when the world is terrifying and unsafe, there can still be kindness. There can still be comfort. There can still be hope. The courthouse hallway buzzed with quiet conversations as Judge retreated to her chambers to make her decision. Emma sat on his lap in the waiting area, finally calm, finally present, occasionally glancing toward Officer and Max, who waited nearby. The German shepherd's eyes never left the little girl, as if he understood his job wasn't finished yet. 45 minutes later, they were called back into the courtroom. Judge's decision was swift and unequivocal. Full custody, too, with supervised visitation rights for Emma's mother once she completed a domestic violence recovery program. Emma's father would have no contact until he completed court-mandated anger management, substance abuse treatment, and underwent psychological evaluation. The judge's voice was firm as she outlined the terms, her eyes occasionally drifting to Emma, who sat quietly in her grandmother's lap. "This child," Judge said, looking directly at Emma's father via video conference from the county jail, "deserves to feel safe in her own home. She deserves to sleep without fear. She deserves a childhood that isn't defined by violence and terror. That ends today." When the gavel fell, wept with relief. Sarah hugged them both, and Emma, processing what it all meant in her 3-year-old way, simply asked, "Can I say goodbye to Max?" Judge, who had already removed her robe and was preparing to leave, paused. "Officer, do you have a moment?" Brought Max over immediately. Emma slid off her grandmother's lap and wrapped her arms around the dog one last time. "Thank you for helping me be brave," she whispered into his fur. "You're the best in the whole world." Max's tail wagged slowly, gently, and he licked Emma's cheek with careful tenderness. "Emma," said, kneeling beside them, "Max and I work here at the courthouse, so if you ever need to come back, we'll be here. And maybe, if your grandma says it's okay, we could visit you sometime." Emma's face lit up with joy so pure it hurt to witness. "Really? You'd come visit me?" "Really," promised, not knowing in that moment that he was making a commitment that would change the trajectory of his entire career. 3 days later, Judge sat in her chambers with Sarah Mitchell and courthouse administrator, discussing something unprecedented. "What happened in that courtroom," Judge began, "was extraordinary. Emma's breakthrough wasn't just about one child. It highlighted a gap in our system. We have therapy dogs in hospitals, schools, airports. Why not courthouses, where some of our most vulnerable witnesses face their greatest fears?" A budget-conscious administrator who'd spent 20 years saying no to expensive programs found himself nodding. "I watched the footage from the courtroom cameras. What that dog did for that child. We can't put a price on that." Leaned forward. "Max is certified through the Courthouse Dogs Foundation. There are organizations across the country training dogs specifically for legal settings. With proper funding, we could establish a full-time facility dog program here." "How much are we talking?" asked, already mentally rearranging budget allocations. "Training, veterinary care, insurance, handler time. Roughly $40,000 a year for a full-time program," explained. Judge didn't hesitate. "Write the proposal. I'll present it to the county commissioners personally." Sarah spoke up. "I work with a dozen cases like Emma's every month. If we'd had access to a facility dog program earlier, maybe Emma wouldn't have suffered 3 weeks of silence. This could be preventative, not just reactive." Within 2 weeks, Judge stood before the county commission with a passionate presentation. She showed them carefully edited footage of Emma's testimony, the silence, the breakthrough, the healing. She presented research studies proving that facility dogs reduced witness anxiety, improved testimony accuracy, and helped traumatized children engage with the legal system. But what really sealed the decision was when she said, 3 weeks ago, a 3-year-old girl couldn't speak because her trauma had stolen her voice. One therapy dog gave it back. How many other Emmas are out there? How many other children could we help? The commission approved the funding unanimously. 6 months later, the county courthouse facility dog program officially launched with Max as its first full-time therapy dog, transitioned from patrol to a specialized position as Max's handler and program coordinator. The local news covered the story, protecting Emma's identity but sharing her journey, and the response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from across Alabama. 3 other counties reached out to establish similar programs. National organizations featured county as a model. A local nonprofit established a fund specifically for training courthouse therapy dogs. Within a year, Max was joined by 2 more dogs. Bailey, a golden retriever who specialized in working with sexual assault survivors, and Scout, a Labrador trained for Veterans Court. The program expanded to include not just child witnesses, but anyone who needed emotional support during legal proceedings. Emma's story became the foundation for Alabama House Bill 327, the Courthouse Facility Dog Act, which provided state funding for therapy dog programs in courthouses statewide. 12 counties adopted the program within 2 years. Within 5 years, it spread to neighboring states. 2 years after that day, Emma, now a confident, talkative 5-year-old, stood in the courthouse garden wearing her best dress, pink this time with flowers. Stood beside her, tears of joy streaming down her face. Sarah Mitchell was there, along with Judge, dozens of courthouse staff, and a small gathering of children whose lives had been touched by the facility dog program. They were gathered for Max's retirement ceremony. At 8 years old, Max had served as a courthouse therapy dog for 3 years, helping over 200 witnesses find the courage to testify. But age and the physical demands of the work had caught up with him, and had made the difficult decision to retire his partner. Max changed everything, Judge said in her speech, her voice thick with emotion. He showed us that justice isn't just about law and procedure. It's about creating space for truth, healing, and hope. He taught us that sometimes the most important voices in a courtroom come from those who've been silenced by trauma, and he reminded us that compassion has a place in even the most formal legal proceedings. When it was time for Emma to present Max with his retirement collar, a beautiful leather piece engraved with "My Hero," the now 5-year-old walked forward with confidence her younger self couldn't have imagined. "Max," she said clearly, her voice strong and sure, "you saved me when I was really, really scared. You showed me that even when bad things happen, there are still good doggies and good people in the world. Thank you for being my friend." She fastened the collar around Max's neck, then hugged him tight. Max's tail wagged and he licked her face, and everyone watching knew they were witnessing something profound, the visible proof that healing is possible, that trauma doesn't have to be the end of the story, that sometimes hope comes with 4 legs and a wagging tail. The legacy continues. Today, over 50 courthouses across the southeastern United States have facility dog programs. The model pioneered in county has been replicated nationwide. Thousands of traumatized witnesses, children and adults alike, have found their voices with the help of trained therapy dogs. Emma is now in elementary school, thriving in a safe home with her grandmother. She still sees a therapist, still has occasional nightmares, but she's no longer defined by that terrible night. She's a girl who loves art class, has 3 best friends, and occasionally visits retired Max and at their home. Max lives comfortably in his backyard, enjoying retirement with long naps in the sun and regular visits from the children he helped. 12 other dogs have been trained in his image, carrying on his legacy of compassion and healing. And every single one of them wears a collar that bears the same inscription as Max's retirement gift. My hero. Because that's what they are. Heroes who don't wear badges or carry guns, who don't make arrests or write tickets, but who perform the most important police work of all. They help broken people feel safe enough to heal. Emma's voice had been stolen by violence. Max gave it back, and in doing so, he gave hope to countless others who needed to know that even in their darkest moments, even when the world feels dangerous and terrifying, there is still kindness. There is still comfort. There is still hope. The end.